Hill 2 has been heralded as one of the best horror games of all time.
Silent Hill 2.
Silent Hill 2.
Silent Hill 2.
Silent Hill was one of many franchises that I always had a mild curiosity about, despite never playing any title in the entire franchise. I never owned a copy, and never had enough motivation to jump in at any point, no matter how many times I thought about it. Regardless of the fame and recognition it carried in the industry, by the time I was starting to be curious about the franchise and what it offered, it had already started its decline in the early 2010s with underwhelming releases like Silent Hill Homecoming and Silent Hill Downpour. Despite its questionable reception, Silent Hill carried this reverence that very few franchises ever did, let alone horror franchises, with the only real competition in the AAA horror genre for the longest time being Resident Evil. My first proper visit to Silent Hill wasn't a visit at all, but a tease of an incredible experience that will never come to be. PT, the Silent Hill that never was, set to be directed by Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro, with Norman Reedus starring as the lead before Kojima left Konami, with Silent Hills being unceremoniously cancelled. PT's atmosphere, storytelling, and puzzles were so impressive, and the whole package works so well as a standalone little game that many people, to this day, still regard it alone as one of the greatest horror games ever made, despite only being a teaser for something larger and greater, until Konami. From then on, just like other Konami franchises like Castlevania and Metal Gear, Silent Hill started to wither away in 2015 with the cancellation of Kojima's Silent Hills. For nearly a decade, Silent Hill was completely forgotten, with fans left to turn to other horror titles to get their fix of existential horror and overwhelming dread that Silent Hill had mastered. And there were plenty of titles, especially in the indie horror space, that were impressive and recaptured some of that same magic. But when Silent Hill 2 Remake was announced alongside a brand new mainline title and whatever Silent Hill Ascension was supposed to be, fans were hopeful that Konami was finally returning to the infamous town and doing so in order to remake what many fans consider not just the pinnacle of the series, not just one of the greatest horror games ever, but one of the greatest video games and video game narratives ever created. As I said before, I've never played any Silent Hill. I can't make any direct comparisons to the original Silent Hill 2, other than what I've heard echoed through the industry grapevine, which is some impressions regarding this remake being very faithful and respectful to the original. The reception was surprising given the previous underwhelming horror titles in Bloober Team's history. Many were expecting, and some were even hoping, for this remake to be some kind of critical or commercial failure. I don't want any preconceived notions of the original to cloud my judgment. I'm treating this remake the same way that I imagine Konami expects most players to, as their first Silent Hill title and introduction to this world. I have reservations regarding the overabundance of remakes in the wider gaming industry, and I very much oppose that this title is the only legal way of experiencing this journey, given that the original Silent Hill 2, and much of the franchise, isn't available on any current storefronts. I think previous concerns with this remake and the discussion of games as an art form would have been easier to digest had this been presented as an alternate, equal take on Silent Hill 2, rather than a supposed replacement, but here we are. I would have liked something akin to Resident Evil 4, which is so widely available on every platform that the remake was never going to replace it. But for Silent Hill, this is all we have without turning to emulation. For the sake of keeping things simple in this review and without delving too much into the original, I'm gonna assume that most of the greatest elements in this remake were taken directly from the original. I'm also going to assume that many of my criticisms will be unique to this title alone. That is to say, on the subject of the story, art direction, characters, and world, all of these elements are simply incredible.
Silent Hill? You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did.
Silent Hill 2 begins with a perfectly simple mystery. James Sunderland receives a letter from his beloved wife Mary, who passed away about 3 years ago, writing to him and inviting him to return to their special place in the town of Silent Hill. Immediately, the striking art direction creeps in, with an overwhelming fog that envelops the town and is as synonymous with the franchise as the infamous monsters that hunt the player. As James approaches the town with the excellent dynamic sound design that highlights crunching leaves, rustling wind, breaking glass, and horrific monstrous moans, gurgles, and gargles, we're introduced to one of the 4 main characters that James will interact with during his journey, Angela. Much like many of the other characters that James interacts with, Angela is standoffish, aloof, Every conversation in the game comes across as incomplete. Characters will display strange emotions or behaviors, or say things that don't quite make a lot of sense. It's almost as if watching two people speaking through a language barrier, and all of it adds to the intrigue of the town, and the mystery behind what's really going on, and what James himself is going through. The dichotomy of reality versus fiction is a prevalent theme through Silent Hill 2, and the strange characters that James meets leads to a very unique, dreamlike quality that is punctuated by the art direction and sound design. Silent Hill 2 is one of the most accurate depictions of what a playable nightmare would come across as. When you approach the town, and the incredible and impactful soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka begins to creep in, what immediately drew me into Silent Hill 2 was the freedom the game offers in its early moments and pacing. After being given a little direction about where to go, you're given complete freedom to explore the early streets at your own leisure. While the main objectives and puzzles in order to progress are completed in linear order, Silent Hill 2 revels in giving the player the freedom to explore and wander at their own pace, without feeling like you're wasting time or ignoring the story. This break from an aggressive, haunted house-style linearity is a stark contrast to some of Bloober Team's previous entries, like Layers of Fear. And unlike in many horror and adventure titles, where items like journals and audio logs can come across as interesting but unnecessary flavor for world building sometimes, much of the extra items you collect all feel important for developing the town of Silent Hill and James as a character. Everything about his journey to find Maria is so important when you consider his viewpoint. I never found myself lost wandering the town thanks to the map that James will update with discovered locks, doors, other points of interest that can help guide the player and remind them of what they were doing or where they were headed. It was never overbearing. Nearly every point of interest on the map is something you yourself have to discover, and Bloober strikes a very smart balance of giving you just enough information to never be lost, but never giving you too much so as to take away any agency and progression. As the town comes to life, being introduced to the combat system, which primarily consists of dodging and hitting monsters with telegraphed attacks, the early moments of the game can feel incredibly overwhelming for a new player, in a good way. Over time, despite the gameplay loop never evolving past finding new weapons, the confidence you gain as you search for Mary is palpable. That reflection on growth is a great example of how differently you look at James, Silent Hill, and the journey as a whole after completing it, which is a major compliment I give to the developers, as I imagine it's the exact kind of impact they were hoping players would take from this title. Combat is visceral. Loud, weighty. Every time James swings his bat or pipe, the animation combined with the camera work puts so much force into every swing, which is just emphasized with the sound design. And icing on that sweet physical cake is the stomp that James can perform on monsters long after they've died, punctuated by his grunts and cries with every stomp. Whether using the spiked bat to land killing blows, your pistol to aim for leg shots that'll put monsters in a vulnerable position, or the shotgun for a devastating one-hit kill, Silent Hill 2's combat, for as simple as it is, never got tiresome thanks to the excellent feedback and sound design. As a survival horror, Silent Hill 2 does a good job of distributing healing items so that you never feel overpowered nor completely helpless. That is, until around the halfway point of the game, where you're much more familiar and comfortable with combat and enemy attack patterns. I was stockpiling more medicine and syringes in a hospital. By the end, James could have been placed on a level of doom and had enough healing items to survive it. The game's normal default difficulty starts off on the right note, especially as a newcomer who's familiar with survival horror but not an expert on the genre. But the difficulty quickly shifts by the second half. Even if you had been struggling with combat and the harder late game enemy variants, the game still provides just a bit too many healing items and ammo. If you're at all familiar with the survival horror genre, then I imagine you'll feel comfortable on the hard difficulty. Combat is reserved for the monsters that James encounters. The grotesque, fleshy physical monsters that charge at him, or spit acid, or just flail a knife around. The other monsters that James encounters are within. Walking, wailing body bags that wear high heels, living, fleshy mannequins that will hide in corners for your arrival to jump out and charge you, and nurses wielding knives with skin-tight clothing and leggings, and of course, the infamous Pyramid Head, which acts as a boss encounter as well as a stalker during a later portion of the game. Although I was surprised to find that Pyramid Head, in all his horrifying glory, is featured surprisingly little in the game when compared to recent stalker-type enemies like the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation, or Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake. His appearances can be counted on one hand, and they're all very brief. His few appearances felt appropriate and carefully thought out, and his design is punctuated with the same hateful and sexual energy that is found in every part of this journey. The underlying, highly sexualized essence within all the monster designs is a perfect complement for James's journey to find Mary, and without ever having to explain anything to the player or dumb things down, perfectly and wordlessly serves as a mirror for James's own psyche, how he thinks of Maria, and how he thinks of himself. As James continues further in search of Mary, his perception of reality is regularly challenged with meeting the other visitors like Eddie, Laura, and all of them as off-putting and standoffish as they are miserable and helpless. The contrast between James's desperate, relatable search for Mary and the borderline hateful personalities of the other characters he meets is fascinating. Normally, I'm adverse to cutscenes in a lot of modern games, as they regularly feel like they muddle pacing in order to deliver mediocre stories that aren't well thought out or interesting. But with Silent Hill 2, I was waiting for the next encounter with another visitor. With every mystery that was answered, a new, more interesting question was developed, and I was glued to the screen when the characters, who all had stellar voice acting, offered a brief moment of reprieve to learn more about their stories, their tragedies, and the events that led them to the same town that called us. The biggest highlight among them is...
My name is Maria. I don't look like a ghost, do I?
Maria, who resembles Mary, drawing in James like a siren. And she doesn't just resemble Mary, she quite literally is her, in that she's played by the same actress, face, voice, and all. Maria serves as an unexpected light in the overwhelming fog of Silent Hill, acting as what feels like the first and only kind interaction that James experiences during his visit. She's seemingly everything that Mary isn't, and maybe exactly what James wants. We descend further with regular interactions and revisits with Maria that come to grow darker and feel more hopeless as we inch closer to our special place. The pacing and progression for the game was surprising. Instead of acting like a linear haunted house type horror game like Layers of Fear or Metroidvania style titles like Resident Evil that focus on upgrades, keys, and backtracking to unlock new areas, Silent Hill 2 reminded me most of a traditional 2D Zelda, with regular visits to what I would call dungeons. Enclosed indoor spaces that are very linear, claustrophobic, with a major emphasis on solving puzzles and finding documents, logs, and other lore that expand on the location you're in, like an abandoned apartment complex or the local town hospital. Each of the dungeons feature multiple floors to explore, and the environmental detail and storytelling is at its best here, with so much of the history of the world being delivered from hung-up wall art to desecrated furniture and offices. You'll also find the most concentrated group of enemies here, but the strongest and most surprising similarity to Zelda is every dungeon featuring the other world, where James will slip into a crack between reality to a darker, warped version of the dungeon he was in. The other world's layout is near completely mirrored from the overworld, with enemies receiving more aggressive variants and being depicted as more blatantly sexual than before, with black spandex and skin-tight latex that is equal parts erotic as it is disturbing, reminding me of some of the Cenobite designs from the Hellraiser series. The other world highlights some of Silent Hill 2 at its very best, with disgustingly gorgeous interior design, harsh oppressive lighting, and an even darker turn for the soundtrack that flips from melancholic and tragic to angry and horrifying. It's also where most of the game's boss fights are featured, against giant, screeching, mechanical abominations. While I adore the creepy, unsettling, quiet fog of the overworld, the other world represents Silent Hill 2 at its most visceral and grittiest level. And it also represents the game at its worst. Most of my major criticisms with Silent Hill 2 are either found in the other world or emphasized greatly. The other world is sometimes just too dark. Literally. The game excels at building tension, intrigue, and hopelessness in the overworld, where James is drowned out by the fog and depressing weight of the town of Silent Hill, and most of the fear is not delivered by the monsters he finds, but the dread and anxiety that makes the player think about the horrifying monsters that we cannot see. The other world, on the other hand, is sometimes the exact opposite. It's loud, in your face, aggressive. That dichotomy of sadness and anger is great when it works, but the charm will wear off. Most of the fear of the other world revolves around forcing the player to rely on their flashlight to guide themselves around dark, dank hallways, where enemies will regularly sneak up on you and nearly jump scare you to get a free and cheap hit. It very quickly turns from frightening to just frustrating. The pacing and placement of the otherworld sections feels poorly implemented. Most of the time, it occurs after completing the overworld portion of a dungeon, where you'll spend almost 2 hours in a focused play space, fighting enemies and solving puzzles along the way, only to then be presented with the exact same gameplay loop for another 2 hours, except this time with harder enemies and less lighting. By the end of the Otherworld sections, I was praying for some kind of break in the pacing that would allow me to go back to exploring the town in a more relaxed manner, that prioritized loneliness and dread over excessive enemies and limited visibility. While the pacing of the Otherworld is inoffensive early on, given the novelty, it wears off by the third main dungeon of the game, which feels especially padded out compared to the rest of the game. The Otherworld and the third dungeon, the prison, do carry some absolute standout moments of the game. The build-up, with James descending down what felt like an infinite staircase to the abyss, with the visual design and technical aspects of the lighting absolutely shining here. One of the boss fights featured here revolves around Angela and is an incredible blend of gameplay and storytelling, with James stepping into Angela's own childhood memories regarding her abusive father. As James progresses through the fight, both attacking and running away from Angela's father, there's moments in the fight where we slip through a crack in the walls to hide from the father, and there, we see childhood toys scattered on the floor. We, as the player, are literally reliving Angela's childhood trauma, following in the footsteps of a scared, tormented child who had no choice but to hide from her abuser in her own home. Angela's story regarding abuse and trauma was one of the biggest surprise standouts of the entire game for me. But this highlight took place at the end of the prison, which featured noticeably less world building and storytelling compared to the previous dungeons, and was also the literal darkest part of the game, featuring an excessively long back and forth trek to receive 5 weights to complete this balance puzzle, with the indoor lighting that had to be manually turned on with switches, and new enemies that would crawl on walls and jump at James in the dark. Every negative element was culminating here in what was easily the lowest point for the game. And then it just kept going. Once the prison was complete, we're immediately thrown into a labyrinth featuring a pretty dull cube rotation puzzle that had to be completed 3 times, with 3 different treks into more uninteresting, dark, dank hallways that featured almost zero progression of the narrative or any intrigue to the town, aside from some interesting highlights featuring Maria and Pyramid Head, and interesting implications regarding James's connection to the both of them. I was about 4 or 5 hours in at this point, and any horror or charm was fading away. I couldn't wait for this section to end. Out of my own curiosity, I went on How Long to Beat to check the average playtime of the original and compare it with the remake. I find that many of the reported lengths on the site are comparable to my own playtimes, and sure enough, the remake was seemingly twice as long as the original title, and no more was that padding apparent than here. The pacing is at its best when focusing on the direct narrative and characters, and while the story cutscenes are wonderfully acted, Silent Hill 2 suffers from some awkward facial animations and character models that don't always hold up to scrutiny. Lip syncing can be a bit of a problem. Many times the animations of the faces don't line up or emote quite the way you expect them to, although there are some moments with certain lighting that do highlight some stellar quality, particularly in the facial textures and hair for James. While the game is visually impressive most of the time, there's also times where it doesn't feel like it's taking full advantage of the PS5 hardware, which is strange given the exclusivity for the title. This isn't a major issue, it's still a gorgeous game, but the PS5 exclusivity is strange as the visual fidelity doesn't really shine compared to some of Sony's other exclusive releases. Although Sony's first-party studios have demonstrated how well they can take advantage of their own hardware, so I don't fault Bloober Team for not living up to them. Thankfully, once the prison and labyrinth are completed and after a disturbing boss fight with Eddie that comes across less like a fight and more like James putting down a rabid animal, the final dungeon of the game, featuring Mary's special place, is a much-needed high note. The ending section of the game, focusing on the relationship between Laura, Mary, and James, and featuring a slower, atmospheric crawl to the top of the hotel to reach their special place and find out the truth regarding some videotape that was recorded the last time the two were together. James has a moment with Laura to discuss Mary, how he feels about her, and it's one of the first times in the narrative that we hear about Mary's perspective and feelings about James from Laura. Serving as a nice break from the never-ending labyrinth and prison, the hotel serves as a delightful build-up to the climax of the game, working our way to the special place marked on our map in Mary's own handwriting. Once we reach it, we discover the truth behind James and Mary.
Promise you'll take me again, James.
Mary's gone. She's dead. I killed her.
Laura, almost acting as James's conscience, who had regularly taunted James throughout his trip to Silent Hill like a representation of his inner guilt and disgust, tells James what he already thinks of himself.
Killer! Why'd you do it? I hate you! I knew it. You didn't care about her. I hate you, James! I hate you! I hate you! I hate you!
James!
Mary?
But after hearing Mary's voice one more time, calling out to James from the other world, we have one more trip to reunite with her. Thankfully, like the rest of the hotel, the otherworld portion is also delightful. The lighting is unique and colorful, it doesn't rely on cheap attacks from enemies in the dark, and it's paced pretty well. It isn't long until we have one final moment with Angela, who says what I consider to be one of the most poignant lines in the entire story.
You see it too? For me, it's always like this.
One final confrontation with two pyramid heads, representing what I think is James's regret towards Mary and Maria, and the promise that he'll have to eventually break for one of them, ending in... What comes next depends on our choices and ending, but I'm reviewing the story I experienced and the ending I received. We move on to our reunion with Mary, whereas James calls her Maria, as he apologizes for not giving in to whatever temptation he felt towards Maria and saying goodbye to her and the town. With one final fight against a monstrous abomination of Maria, rejecting the escape that she represented for James, we finally receive Mary's complete letter, and we come to understand.
I want you to go on. I want you to live. For yourself and for others.
Mary forgives us. James hated Mary and was so desperate for his life back and blamed Mary for ruining it, so much to the point that he took it upon himself to kill her. And the guilt and trauma of that decision was so overbearing that James visited Silent Hill as a way to confront that choice. I don't think he could have lived with himself, but Mary, racked in her own guilt regarding her disease and how it impacted her life and James, instead decides that she wants James to live, to move on and know that despite everything, James made her happy. James kills Mary, and she forgives him. Whether this is James's own twisted way of justifying his murder so he can rid himself of the guilt that's been torturing him, or one final act of love from Mary, James has reunited with Mary and can finally move on. Once James forgives himself and decides to live, he leaves Silent Hill with Laura, and as I said before, Laura represents James's guilty conscience, trapped in Silent Hill. Now, with his conscience guilt-free, he can leave with her.
James, you made me happy.
Silent Hill 2's story is about guilt, trauma, and how different individuals, Angela, Eddie, Maria, Mary, and James, face their traumas in an effort to seek forgiveness. The entire game revolves around James, how he views himself and the other visitors of Silent Hill. There's so many moments and interactions left up to interpretation, which leads to great replay value when you can view the story from a brand new perspective. The game encourages repeat visits to Silent Hill, as it's necessary to achieve several of the other possible endings. Silent Hill 2 is about the destruction that guilt and trauma can have on an individual, the temptations to run away from that trauma, hide from it, even if it'll never disappear. Instead, in order to confront trauma and guilt, we have to accept it as a part of our lives and forgive ourselves for the pain we cause onto ourselves and our loved ones. Despite some major pacing and padding issues regarding the dungeons and the otherworld, the story of Silent Hill 2 resonated with me as strongly as I imagine it did with original fans in 2001. I wonder if Konami was left as surprised with the reception of the title that fans were, given how little faith people had in Bloober Team's ability to deliver a title that recaptured the intrigue and magic of the original. I can't speak on if anything was left behind, but what I can say is that this remake title is very well made and engrossed me in a way that very few narratives ever do. With the next mainline title in full production, in the recent announcement of Silent Hill 2 selling 2 million copies, I'm hoping that Konami sees this as a surefire sign to take more chances on a franchise that was built in unorthodox and thought-provoking direction. Who knows how Bloober Team would have handled having to develop a Silent Hill title from complete scratch, rather than having the bones and story of Silent Hill 2 to work from. But at this point, I think they've proven themselves capable enough to tackle their own original Silent Hill, or instead redirect their efforts to revisit some of the lesser-known titles, like the original game that started it all, which is still beloved and influential in its own right. Regardless of whatever the future may hold for Silent Hill, whether it moves on or dies here with this remake, Silent Hill 2 is a nightmare descent into trauma and guilt that I'm going to revisit again and again.
I am here for you, James.